The successful Bolshevik rising of October 1917 marked the beginning rather than the end of the Russian Revolution. The big test was whether the Bolsheviks could retain their power and build upon it. In power, the Bolsheviks under Lenin faced huge difficulties in trying to consolidate their hold over what had been a czarist empire. These can be identified as four basic questions. Could the Bolsheviks survive at all? If so, could they extend their control over the whole of Russia? Could they negotiate a swift end to the war? And could they bring economic stability to Russia? The traditional Soviet view was that after the Bolsheviks had taken power under Lenin, they transformed old Russia into a socialist society by following a set of measured, planned reforms that had been previously prepared. Few historians now accept that was what happened. Lenin's policy is now seen as having been pragmatic adjustments to the harsh realities of the situation. From the beginning, the Bolshevik regime was engaged in a desperate struggle for survival. In their government of Russia, the Bolsheviks were working from hand to mouth. They had few plans to help them. This was because before 1917, they had spent their time in preparing for revolution. They had given little thought to the details of how affairs would be organized once this had been achieved. It had always been a Marxist belief that after the triumph of the proletariat, the state would wither away. Trotsky expressed this simple faith at the time of his appointment in October 1917 when he said, "All we need to do is issue a few decrees, then shut up shop and go home." But circumstances were not to allow such a relaxed approach to government. So Lenin actually had this idea that the government should be based on something called democratic centralism. And that is you have a trained group at the top who ruled everything, and then they ruled, going down to the local Soviets. So he gave the appearance that people had power, but the reality was altogether different. Traditional forms of government had broken down by 1917 with the fall of the Tsardom and the overthrow of the provincial government. So as a result, this meant the Bolsheviks really ruled de facto and not de jure. To put it another way, they were in a position to make up their own rules. And since not all the Soviets were dominated by the Bolsheviks, who in any case were a minority party, Lenin had no intention of letting true democracy get in the way. The notion that it was the Soviets who had taken power and now ruled was simply a convenient cover. From the beginning, whatever claims may have been about Soviets being an authority, it was in fact the Bolsheviks who held power. The key body here was the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party. It was the organization under Lenin's direction that provided the members of the government. In a sense, the Soviet Varkom was a wing of the Bolshevik Party. In theory, the Central Committee derived its authorities from the All-Russian Congress of the Bolshevik Party, whose locally elected representatives voted on policy. In practice, the Congress and the local parties did as they were told. This was in keeping with the principle of democratic centralism. A formula guaranteed that power was exercised from the top down rather than the bottom up. In Bolshevik theory, the October Revolution had marked the victory of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie, of socialism over capitalism. But theory is of little immediate assistance in the circumstances of late 1917. A hard road lay ahead if the Bolsheviks were truly to transform the Russian economy. Before the October Revolution, Lenin had written powerfully against the landlord and grasping capitalist, but he had produced little by the way of a coherent plan for their replacement. It is understandable, therefore, that his policy, after taking power in 1917, was a pragmatic one. He argued that the change from a bourgeoisie to a proletarian economy could not be achieved overnight. The Bolshevik government would continue to use the existing structures until the transition had been completed and a fully fledged socialist system could be adopted. This transitional stage was referred to as state capitalism. Lenin was aware that there were many Bolsheviks who wanted immediate change, But he pointed out that the new regime simply did not possess the power to do this. Its authority did not run past the two major cities of Petrograd and Moscow, and plus they didn't have real true political or military control. Their policies would have to fit within the prevailing circumstances. The war against Germany and Austria had brought Russia to the point of economic collapse. They had a shortage of raw materials and investment capital. There was inflation. The transportation system was wrecked. Hunger gripped most of Russia. And within a few months of the October Revolution, the food crisis had been further deepened by ceding Germany the Ukraine. All of Lenin's economic policies from 1917 on can be seen as attempts to deal with these problems, the most pressing being whether Russia could produce enough food to feed itself. Lenin was a realist on the peasant question. Although he considered that the future lay with the industrial workers, he was very conscious that the peasantry, who made up the mass of the population, were the food producers. The primary consideration, therefore, was how best the peasants could be persuaded or forced to provide adequate food supplies for the nation. Immediately after the coming of the new government, they introduced two measures that were usually regarded as having been initiated by a Bolshevik economic policy. These were the Decree on Land and the Decree on Workers' Control, both issued in November 1917. However, these were not so much new departures as formal recognitions of what had already taken place. The key article of this measure stated, "Private ownership of land shall be abolished forever. Land shall not be sold, purchased, leased, mortgaged, or otherwise alienated. All land, whether state, crown, monastery, church, factory, private, public, peasant, shall be confiscated without compensation and become the property of the whole people and pass into the use of all those who cultivate it." The decree gave Bolshevik approval to what had happened in the countryside since the February Revolution. In many areas, the peasants had overthrown their landlords and occupied their property. Lenin had earlier accepted this when he had adopted the slogan, "Land to the peasants." This measure was largely concerned with authorizing what had already occurred. During 1917, a large number of factories had been taken over by the workers. However, the workers' committees that were formed seldom ran the factories efficiently. The result was a serious fall in industrial output. The decree accepted workers' takeover, but at the same time it instructed the workers' committees to maintain the strictest order and discipline in the workplace. Passing decrees was one thing, enforcing them quite different. A particular problem for the government was that not all the worker communities were dominated by Bolsheviks. Until the party gained greater control at shop level, it would be difficult for the central government to impose itself on the factories. Nevertheless, the government pressed on with its plans for establishing a framework of state direction of the economy, even if effective central control was way off. In December, VIII was set up to take charge of all existing institutions for the regulation of economic life. Initially, VIII was unable to exercise full authority granted to it. However, it did preside over a number of important developments. First, the banks and the railroads were nationalized, foreign debt was canceled, and the transport system was made less chaotic. There were important practical achievements which suggested how effective centralization could be if ran by the Bolshevik regime. While some Bolsheviks may have found the initial pace of the revolutionary change too slow for their liking, there was no doubting that Lenin was determined to impose absolute Bolshevik rule by suppressing of all political opposition. A development that gave the Bolsheviks muscle in dealing with their opponents was the creation in the weeks following the October coup of the Cheka. Essentially, the Cheka was a better organized and more efficient form of the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police, at whose hands nearly every Bolshevik activist had suffered. Its express purpose was to destroy counter-revolution and sabotage, terms that were so elastic they could be stretched to cover anything of which the Bolsheviks disapproved. As a revolutionary, Lenin had never worried much about how many people supported the Bolsheviks. Mere numbers did not concern him. He had no faith in democratic elections, which he dismissed as tricks by which the bourgeoisie kept itself in power. His primary objective was to win mass support, but to create a party capable of seizing power when the opportunity came. This was why he had refused to join a broad front opposition movement before 1917, and why he had consistently opposed any form of cooperation with the provisional government. After the success of the October coup in 1917, Lenin was even more determined not to allow elections to undermine the Bolsheviks' newly won power. However, there was an immediate problem. The October Revolution had come too late to prevent the elections to an all-Russian Constituent Assembly from going ahead in November as planned. When the results came through by the end of the year, they did not make pleasant reading for the Bolsheviks. They had been outvoted by nearly 2-1 by the Social Revolutionaries. They had won only 24% of the total vote. They had gained barely a quarter of the seats in the assembly. Frankly, Lenin didn't care. His original idea was to have a constituent assembly just to kind of get things done, but he was in power now, and furthermore, since it was overwhelmingly non-Bolshevik, it would almost certainly make life difficult for his government. One possibility was that he could have tried to work with the new assembly, but that was not how Lenin operated. He was not a Democrat. He did not deal in compromise. He was a revolutionary who believed that the only way to govern was not by compromise, but by totally crushing all opposition. Hence his response to the Constituent Assembly when it gathered in January 1918 was simple and ruthless. After only a day's session, it was dissolved at gunpoint by the Red Guards. Few members tried to protest, but with rifles trained at their heads, their resistance soon left. It was a bitter end to the dreams of liberals and reformers. There would not be another democratic body in Russia until the collapse of the Soviet communism over 70 years later. Lenin's act of violence in January 1918 was to be viewed in context. The Bolsheviks held on to power. It was very precarious, though. Indeed, the prospects of Bolshevik survival at all seemed slim. There was strong and widespread opposition to them inside the country. Also, Russia was still at war with Germany, with the Allies, France, and Britain, all set to interfere should the new Russian government make a separate peace. In such an atmosphere, the Bolsheviks were not prepared to consider power sharing. Lenin justified the Bolshevik actions by arguing that the original reason for an electing an assembly, the establishing of an all-Russian representative body, had already been achieved by the creation of a Soviet government in October 1917. The people's will had expressed itself in the October Revolution. Lenin's ruthlessness caused unease even among some of his own supporters. Many foreign communists were appalled by Lenin's behavior. Rosa Luxemburg, a German socialist, condemned the elimination of democracy in Russia. She complained bitterly that the remedy provided by Lenin and Trotsky was worse than the disease it supported to cure. Such criticisms did not move Lenin. As he saw it, the desperately vulnerable position the Bolsheviks were in, attempting to impose themselves on Russia while surrounded by enemies on all sides, demanded the sternest of measures. Nor was he short of theory to justify his actions. The concept of democratic centralism, which required the absolute obedience of party members to the leaders, perfectly fitted the situation in which the Bolsheviks found themselves. Lenin and Trotsky were united in their suppression of the Constituent Assembly. However, they differed in their approach on peace with Germany. Lenin wanted it immediately and Trotsky wanted a delay. Lenin shifted his position sometime around April 1917, maybe possibly coinciding with Germany helping him get back to Russia. I don't know. Just a thought there. But now his thinking had changed, and Russia's military exhaustion made it impossible for it to fight on. If Germany eventually won the war on both fronts, it would retain the Russian territory it now possessed. But if Germany lost the war against the Russian allies, Russia would regain its occupied lands. In the first eventuality, Russia would not be worse off. In the second, it would actually gain. It was therefore pointless for Bolshevik Russia to continue to fight. An interesting aspect of Lenin's readiness to make peace with Germany was that it was not wholly ideological. Between 1914 and 1917, the German Foreign Office had given substantial amounts of money to Lenin and the Bolsheviks in hope that they would succeed in their revolution and pull Russia out of the war. Germany continued to finance Lenin even after the October Revolution and the armistice of December 1917. A settlement with Germany was therefore very much in Lenin's interest, since it was the best guarantee against the drying up of the lucrative source of Bolshevik revenue. Trotsky took a middle position between Lenin, who wanted a peace straight away, and those Bolsheviks and left revolutionaries who pressed for the continuation of the war as a revolutionary crusade against imperialist Germany. Trotsky shared Lenin's view that the Bolshevik Russia had no realistic chance of successfully continuing the military struggle against Germany. However, it had hope that within a short time the German armies would collapse upon the Western Front and revolution would follow in Germany. Trotsky was determined to make the peace talks a protracted affair. He wanted to buy time for the Bolshevik agitators to exploit the mutinies in the Austro-German armies. Trotsky was pretty much rude during this time period. He even coined the slogan, neither peace nor war, which his policy was to really confuse and irritate the Germans. Trotsky showed his contempt for what he called the bourgeoisie propriety by consistently flouting the traditional etiquette of European diplomacy. He would yawn loudly while German representatives were speaking, or start private conversations with his Bolshevik colleagues rather than listen to what was being said. When he did join in formal negotiations, he would ignore the point under discussion and launch into revolutionary speeches, praising the October coup and really insulting the bourgeoisie. Germany's chief negotiator was Field Marshal Hindenburg, and he complained that Trotsky degraded the conference table to the level of a thumper street corner. Lenin and Trotsky behaved more like victors than vanquished, while trying to sow the seeds of political dissolution in the ranks of our army. What Hindenburg had failed to grasp was that Trotsky and Lenin did indeed see themselves as the victors, potential if not actual. They were not bothered by the thought of national defeat. Their conviction was that time and history were on their side. They believed that the great international political victory was imminent. It is important to remember that Lenin and Trotsky were international revolutionaries. They had limited loyalty towards Russia as a nation. Their first concern was to spread the proletarian revolution. This readiness to subordinate Russian national interests explains why, to the dismay of most Russians and many Bolsheviks, the Soviet delegation was eventually willing to sign a devastating peace treaty as soon as it became clear that the exasperated Germans were seriously considering leaving. Trotsky's outlook as an international revolutionary did not prevent him from scoring a sharp nationalist propaganda point. Before signing the treaty in March 1918, the Soviet representative declared, under instructions from Trotsky, that it was not freely negotiated settlement, but a German imposed on a helpless Russia. Lenin knew signing this treaty was not going to be popular, but he was not an idealist or a romantic. He knew that Bolshevik Russia could not continue to fight. They must sign peace to obtain breathing space to re-cooperate for the struggle. Lenin added that he expected that before long Russia would be in a position to reclaim its lost territory, since in the aftermath of war a violent conflict would soon develop among the capitalist power. The main struggle would be between the English and German finance capital. His rallying cry was therefore, let the revolution utilize this struggle for its own ends. Lenin's argument was a powerful one, yet he still experienced great difficulty in convincing his colleagues. The issue was debated bitterly in the Central Committee. In the end, Lenin gained his way by a majority by only one in the critical committee division. A profound issue lay at the base of Bolshevik disagreements. To understand this, it has to be reemphasized that Lenin and Trotsky were primarily international revolutionaries. They expected workers' risings based on the Russian model to sweep across Europe. Purely national conflicts would soon be superseded by an international class struggle of the workers. Lenin and Trotsky regarded the crippling terms of this treaty as of small account when set against the great sweeping change that world revolution would bring. Not all Bolsheviks shared this vision. A number known as left communists condemned the signing of the treaty, but in the end, Lenin convinced them that they needed absolute party loyalty in this time of crisis. And so, even though there was serious opposition to Lenin's leadership, and it might have, grown had it not had a series of military events in Western Europe save the day. What eventually destroyed the argument of the left communists and the left SRs was the collapse of Germany's Western Front in August of 1918, followed by the almost total withdrawal of German forces from Russia. Lenin's gamble that circumstances would soon make the treaty meaningless had paid off. It strengthened his hold over the party and provided the opportunity to expel the left social revolutionaries from the government and to outlaw them politically. The Bolsheviks' crushing of the Constituent Assembly in January 1918, followed by their outlawing of all other parties, showed that they were not prepared to share power. This bid for absolute authority made civil war highly likely, given that the Bolsheviks had a limited grip on Russia in the early years after the October Revolution. They were bound to face military opposition from a wide range of opponents who were not prepared to accept being ruled by a minority party.